Hi, I'm Corey Johnson for Torah.com with Governor David Paterson, the governor of New York State. We're here at the Adam Clayton Powell office building in Harlem. And Governor, you this upcoming week put on the agenda for the legislative session for the state senate to act on marriage equality here in New York State. Marriage equality has been a big issue here in New York, especially in the light of what happened in Maine last week. What do you expect to happen on Tuesday? Do you expect action to actually take place?
Well, when a governor places a piece of legislation such as this, along with other pieces of legislation, on a special session calendar, it means that there is something extraordinary about the legislation that commands that it be addressed outside of the regular legislative period. What happened here is that this was one of the issues, as were 5 or 6 others, that were on my regular calendar during the session that was completed in June, except that session was interrupted by a leadership fight in the New York State Senate and prohibited us from addressing the issue. The Assembly passed the legislation. So although it's on the special session calendar, it's really only the Senate that needs to pass this legislation so that gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered New Yorkers can start to get married, those who choose to do so.
Have you had any conversations with the Senate leadership, the change in leadership that took place after the, as you mentioned, the leadership battle that took place in June and July, indicating to you whether it will be acted upon this week?
I can't say that I've gotten a clear message as to what's going to happen this week. I have had conversations with everybody on this subject, but regardless of what happens, I have to do to the best of my ability, since I put this legislation on the floor and have already seen it pass in the Assembly, I have to do everything that I possibly can to try to pass it. So I'm talking to members about voting for it, I'm talking to the leadership about putting it on the floor, and I put it on the special session calendar. So I'm satisfied that I have reached the extent of my capacity. But as is the case with a lot of legislation, no one person can make it happen. We're not living in a dictatorship. We live in a democracy. And so I would like to see, as I have always felt, controversial issues come onto the floor of the legislature and get voted up or down. And in this case, I have a feeling that if it got on the floor, it would be voted up.
You were a legislator for many years before you took statewide office, and as you mentioned, New York State is known for not having issues be brought to the floor to be voted on unless you know it's going to be passed. In this issue, it's different, though, because it's a civil rights issue, and people are saying, get people on record. When it's put on record, you do believe that it would actually pass?
Well, I don't think that marriage equality is the only issue that we should have a record of how people feel. We all ran for office. We face the public in elections, and we should face the public in the service of discharging our duties, whether we're legislators or executives as governor. And what I'm saying is when a significant number of people feel that an issue needs to be addressed, and this issue has now been passed twice in the Assembly, it's time for the New York Senate to take this legislation up, whether or not the votes are there to pass the legislation. I think there's this feeling that if legislation fails, that it's this colossal loss for the cause. I find it to be motivational. I think that the public referendum in Maine should inspire us, that there's more work to do, more persuasion to be made, more understanding to be reached, and more sensitivity to be displayed. And those of us who have been catalysts for marriage equality have to regroup and work harder. I sure hope, and I am sure glad, that in the other civil rights movements in this country, let's take maybe the most famous example of resistance. The Emancipation Proclamation that was signed, that took effect on January 1st, 1863, came only 5.5 years after the Dred Scott decision, which actually mandated the existence of slavery. So what those ancestors of ours did at the time that the Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott decision is that they redoubled our efforts. Now I think we're in a generation that's a little soft. I think that we're supposed to get tough at times like this and fight even harder. We're right on the precipice of enabling millions of people to get married who otherwise could not, to get the protections that marriage encompasses that don't exist for them. People who've lived together for 10, 20, 30 years are waiting, hoping that this legislation will pass while they still have the breath to elicit an "I do" on the altar. And I think it's time that it happens. And if I have to see legislation fail so I can identify who voted against it to better persuade them, then I'll take that chance.
President Obama has been criticized nationally by gay and lesbian leaders and advocates for not taking a strong enough position and speaking loudly enough on some of the issues that face the gay and lesbian community. A lot of people in the wake of the loss in Maine last week have said that he should have spoken up on the issue forcefully. He has inserted himself, as you know, in state politics in other places, but the White House has said he doesn't want to get involved in a state like Maine where they have an issue on the ballot. Do you think the president can do more and should do more on leading on gay and lesbian issues?
Well, I don't want to single anybody out in this situation. I think what's more important for all of us isn't to judge or assess what others are doing in their situations. It's for all of us to become more engaged in trying to make marriage equality the law of the land in this entire country. Obviously, this is, with 41 states adopting a Defense of Marriage Act, it's a difficult time for any leader of this country to engage such a controversial issue. That's why, as have many pieces of legislation that were passed federally, originally they passed in the states. Social Security, when it was passed in 1935, had already been adopted in 21 states. Child labor laws and safety in the workplace had already been passed in half the states before it got to the federal government. We have very few states right now. We've lost 2 of them. So we only have really 4 states where a person could expect that they could get married. And New York would be a major step in the right direction. So I think to, in a sense, level the playing field for some of our national leaders, New York has to act and has to act now. And I think for it to act 1 week after Maine came down with a very close decision, but a negative decision, would be a real shot in the arm to those who believe in marriage equality.
This past week, you launched some television ads to kick off the re-election, which is about a little less than a year away. The gay community has been a big supporter of you, and you've been a big supporter of the gay community. Some people are asking, why start this early, about a year away?
I think you notice what happened to a lot of incumbents. A lot of incumbents who I thought were doing a very good job. A lot of incumbents who were trying to manage one of the worst deficits this country has ever experienced, save the Great Depression of 1929. So it's always time to start letting the public know and trying to set the record straight. I want the public to know that I balanced 2 budgets on time in the middle of a recession, have never missed a payment to obligators, have not delayed payments to schools or local governments, and have as strong a credit rating as any other state in the country. This, New York, being the state that was hit the hardest by the recession. Our revenues down over twice the national average. You would think that New York would be in the worst fiscal condition since we were the hardest hit in this country, but it's actually not the case. We're one of 14 states that has not either shut down all their early education and pre-kindergarten programs, gotten rid of many state employees or furloughed them. This state has never engaged in early release programs, literally letting people out of jail because we couldn't pay the bills. We didn't have a downgraded credit rating like other states. We haven't closed 90% of our libraries, as some states have. And we haven't shortened our school week to 4 days, as one state has already engaged in. I'd like people around New York State and basically around America to know that I have managed this state not only responsibly, but effectively, because I was the first governor that pointed out that we were going to have a downturn in the economy. And people said, 6 weeks before Wall Street collapsed, people said that I was obtuse, that I was Chicken Little, who said the sky is falling, and that I was misestimating the deficit. All of them had to take that back. But in the interim, I brought the legislature back in August of 2008 and not only balanced our out-year budget deficit at the time, but we gave ourselves a $500 million cushion so that when the recession came, we weren't hit as hard as we would have been, and that's why we are still one of the top third of states that could come out of this recession as soon as possible. So I want people to know about it as soon as is electronically possible, so that people can give me a fair chance in the upcoming election in 2010.
And you've said it many times, but I just want to hear you say it again. You do plan at this point to run for re-election as governor of New York State.
If you recognize that I said it other times, you're actually not going to hear me say that.
Thank you. I'm Corey Johnson for Torah.com with Governor David Paterson. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.